It was nearly 2:30 in the morning when I turned off the county road and onto the long unlit gravel driveway leading to my house, nestled in the thick woods of rural Pennsylvania. And though I'd driven this path hundreds of times before, something about that night felt different. Maybe it was the unnatural stillness in the air, or the way the fog clung stubbornly to the trees like it was trying to hide something just beyond sight. Or maybe it was just the exhaustion from a 14-hour shift at the hospital where I'd been covering for a nurse who called out sick. But either way, as my headlights sliced through the dense black, revealing the familiar outlines of trees and the edge of my mailbox, I couldn't shake this crawling, unease rising up my spine like cold fingers. I remember shifting in my seat, adjusting the rearview mirror even though there was no traffic behind me, and checking the back seat for no reason other than a creeping instinct, one of those irrational little habits you pick up after hearing too many late-night patient stories about hallucinations, stalkers, or worse. Still, nothing felt off until I pulled into the gravel circle in front of the house and turned off the engine. And then I just sat there for a second, holding the steering wheel with both hands as my eyes adjusted to the darkness. And I saw him, a figure standing perfectly still at the far end of the driveway where the road met the trees, too far to make out details but unmistakably human. Tall, motionless, facing me, not moving or pacing or even reacting to my headlights moments earlier. My heart jumped so violently I thought I was having some kind of stress response, and I squinted through the windshield, hoping it was a trick of the shadows, a tree stump, maybe even a mailbox I'd forgotten about. But as I leaned forward, trying to get a better view, the figure remained, perfectly still, unwavering like a statue carved out of darkness itself, and something in me recoiled at the unnatural stillness of it, how he just stood there in the dead of night as if waiting to be noticed, as if expecting me to notice him. I turned the car's high beams back on to illuminate that part of the driveway, but the fog had thickened there in such a strange, localized way that the light barely pierced it, and instead of clarity, it gave the impression that the figure had become closer, not physically, but in some existential way, like he had grown more real simply because I acknowledged him. My breath caught in my throat and I sat paralyzed, debating whether to get out or just reverse the hell out of the driveway. But I didn't want to look like a lunatic either. After all, I told myself it was probably just someone passing through, maybe a hiker who got turned around or a hunter who lost track of time. But deep down, I knew those weren't plausible explanations. Nobody wandered into this property by accident, and certainly not at this hour, not in this weather, and never to just stand there like that. I forced myself to act normal, grabbing my bag and stepping out of the car as calmly as I could, locking the door behind me and pretending not to glance down the driveway. But I couldn't help myself, and when I did look again, the figure was still there, still watching, still unmoving, and it took everything in me not to break into a sprint for the front door. Once inside, I locked the deadbolt and peered through the narrow glass beside the door, but I couldn't see him from that angle, so I rushed to the upstairs window that overlooked the front yard, and I stared out through the glass, my breath fogging it up as my eyes scanned the dark edge of the property. And there he was, standing even closer now, halfway up the driveway, just outside the circle of light from the porch lamp. And that's when the panic really set in, because there was no way he could have moved that fast unless he ran. And if he did, why would he stop and stand again, watching like some predator playing a game? I backed away from the window and grabbed my phone to call the sheriff's department. But the signal was terrible out here, and it took nearly a full minute to get a single bar, and by the time the call finally connected, I could barely form coherent words, stammering something about a man on my property in the middle of the night, possibly stalking me. Maybe armed, I didn't know. But what I do know is this. When I returned to the window just minutes later, he was gone, vanished like a hallucination, as if the earth had swallowed him whole. The deputies didn't arrive for nearly an hour, and when they did, they found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, just fog and trees, and my growing sense that what I saw wasn't entirely human. I didn't sleep that night, and for the next week, I couldn't walk to my car in the dark without scanning the tree line or feeling like eyes were on me. And it wasn't until several days later that I found something truly disturbing. Tucked beneath the porch, just out of view from the front steps, was a pair of muddy boot prints facing the front door. And beside them, in the dirt, was a single item that hadn't been there before. A small, crumpled piece of paper with my name scrawled. On it in jagged handwriting, and beneath it just 2 words. I watched. It happened last December when I was house-sitting for my aunt, while she traveled for the holidays. And though the arrangement seemed simple, feed the cat, water the plants, and keep the lights on, I had completely forgotten how unsettling her place was at night, especially in the dead of winter, buried in a quiet neighborhood at the edge of town, with no real streetlights and thick frost icing over every window. The first few days were uneventful, just boring really, until Thursday night when I was sitting in the living room around midnight, bundled in a hoodie, watching an old horror movie with the sound down low, when I suddenly heard 3 soft knocks, distinct, spaced evenly, and undeniably coming from the basement door that sat just behind the kitchen. I paused the movie, thinking maybe the house had creaked or the heating pipes had shifted, but then came 3 more knocks, exactly the same rhythm. A little louder this time, as if whoever or whatever was down there wanted to make sure I heard it. I stood up slowly, heart already racing, and crept into the kitchen, my eyes fixed on that old wooden door with its fogged glass window and rusty chain latch, and I told myself it must have been something falling over in the basement, maybe an animal or the cat. But the cat was sitting calmly in the hallway, staring at the door too, ears perked, tail flicking in a way that told me this wasn't a normal house sound. This was something different. I reached for the doorknob, hand trembling, and the moment my fingers touched the metal, I heard a whisper. Yes, an actual whisper from the other side. A breathy voice that said, "I know you're there." So quiet I almost thought I imagined, "Tit?" But it was enough to make me stagger back, slam the kitchen light on, and grab my phone with shaking hands. Of course there was no signal, because why would there be at a time like this? So I stood there, frozen, staring at that door, half expecting it to open on its own, but nothing happened after that. No more knocking, no more whispers, just this heavy, silent tension pressing down on the house. After 10 minutes of silence, I worked up the nerve to open the door just a crack and shine a flashlight down the stairs. And what I saw made me slam it shut and push the kitchen table in front of it. I saw footprints, wet and bare, leading up the basement steps toward the door, like someone had come in from outside, walked around barefoot in the freezing cold, and then stood there knocking for who knows how long. I didn't sleep that night, just stayed up with the cat on my lap and a knife on the coffee table, and when morning finally came and I dared to check the basement, I found those same wet footprints stretching back to the small window near the bottom of the stairs, still slightly ajar despite the cold, and outside in the snow leading away from the house was a single trail of bare footprints heading into the woods, no shoes, no socks, just deep impressions of human feet disappearing into the trees. When my aunt returned days later, and I told her what happened, she got pale and quiet, then said she'd had that window sealed shut months ago after finding it open one morning without explanation, and that every year, during the first snow, she hears knocking at night and just turns up the volume on the TV until it stops. I was dog-sitting for a friend over the weekend at their rural property just outside of Flagstaff, a quiet, tree-wrapped home on a long gravel road with neighbors barely within shouting distance and no light pollution, meaning once the sun dropped. Below the hills, the whole world outside those windows turned pitch black, just me, their anxious Labrador named Gus, and the vast night pressing against the walls. Everything was fine until Saturday night, when around 1:30 a.m., Gus started growling low in his throat, the kind of growl that rattles out of a dog, not when he's annoyed, but when something is wrong, and I got up from the couch to see him standing, rigid by the sliding glass door that led to the backyard, fur on end, tail stiff, eyes locked on something in the dark. I flipped the outside light on and stepped up behind him, trying to calm him down, expecting a coyote or maybe a raccoon. But the yard was empty, except for something I thought was a shadow at first, until I noticed it wasn't moving like a shadow should. It was tall, unnaturally tall, standing just at the edge of the driveway near the trees, and though the outside light didn't fully reach that far, I could make out enough. Long arms hanging by its sides, 2 long legs, no movement, no breathing. Just standing there facing the house, And the most disturbing part was that I couldn't see a face or clothes or anything human, just the suggestion of a shape, like something that had almost figured out how to look like a person, but didn't. Get all the details right. I turned the light off instinctively, then immediately regretted it when I could no longer see where it was, and Gus began barking, snarling at the glass like he wanted to tear through it, which only made my nerves explode, so I backed away from. The door dragged Gus with me, and shut all the blinds as quickly as I could, heart hammering in my ears, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, or a prank, or something other than what my gut told me. Something unnatural. A few minutes later, I heard gravel crunching from the driveway, slow and deliberate, like heavy footsteps approaching the house one at a time, and the sound stopped right outside the front door, which had a decorative frosted window that obscured details but let light and motion through, and that's when I saw it, a silhouette pressed close, perfectly still, as if it were listening for movement inside, and I stood there frozen, not daring to breathe, watching it linger for nearly 5 minutes before, without warning, it turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees without a sound. I barely slept the rest of the night, sitting on the floor with Gus next to me, every light in the house on, knife in hand, and by morning there were no footprints in the gravel, no disturbances in the yard, like nothing had ever been there. But when my friend returned Sunday night and I told him what I saw, his expression darkened, and after a long pause he said, "You're not the first to see it. We don't stay here in the winter anymore."